Welcome to Class Matters, the podcast where we ask the question, what would our country look like if it were governed by and for the working class? In our first episode, Adolph Reed Jr., Gordon Lafer, and Samir Sonti discuss a topic that seems to be popping up more and more frequently in the news, the eroding trust in government among workers in the United States. You are listening to Class Matters, the podcast. Class Matters is a project of the Debs Jones Douglas Institute, which works to promote a government and an economy that works for working people. I'm Catherine Isaac, Executive Director. So let's get started by introducing our panel today. Adolph Reed Jr. has been involved in working class politics for more than half a century. He's Professor Emeritus of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania. His research interests include American and Afro-American politics and political thought, urban politics, and American political development. Also joining us is Gordon Lafer, whose union activism includes running a hotel workers campaign with Local 142 of the International Longshore and Warehouse Union in Hawaii. He served as Senior Labor Policy Advisor for the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Education and Labor. He's written widely on labor and employment policy issues, and he is the author of The 1% Solution: How Corporations Are Remaking America One State at a Time. He is a professor at the University of Oregon and director of its Labor Education and Research Center. We're also joined by Samir Sonti, who has worked as a political organizer for the Pennsylvania Association of Staff, Nurses, and Allied Professionals, and as a researcher for Unite Here, which represents hospitality workers in the US and Canada. He teaches at the City University of New York School of Labor and Urban Studies. Thank you all for being here. I want to start with something we've been hearing from rank and file union members in our Debs Jones Douglas Institute workshops on the crisis of US healthcare. Union members in the workshops largely agree that there is an urgent need for reform of our healthcare system, but we also hear over and over that our government just can't do anything right. Obviously, this is something we need to listen to and to address as we go about our organizing work. And it leads us to the question at the heart of this episode of Class Matters. Have workers in the United States lost faith in government? And if so, what are the implications and the consequences? Adolph, let's start with you.
Well, that's a good question. Seems like a really important one right now. I mean, I'd say the short answer is probably yes. The short answer is probably a little more complicated in the sense that workers seem to have lost faith in government less than a lot of other segments of the population have. But the answer, or the reason for the yes answer, is basically, we've had like closing in on a half century of government at every level tilting away from protecting or, God forbid, advancing the interests and concerns of working people to feeding the financial sector and encouraging, deindustrialization, job loss. And when we look at it again, the big number is that wages and working class standards of living have declined almost annually since 1968. And it makes sense, right? It's no mystery that people would lose faith in government after a while.
Gordon, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I think the answer is kind of yes and no. On the extreme, people used to talk a lot about disillusionment with democracy in Latin America and countries that transitioned from dictatorship to democracy. And then people discovered that the democratically elected government couldn't do anything to improve their lives. And people started feeling, well, maybe it's better to have a strong man ruling who could actually do something. That feels like the most dangerous point that we could be getting to. And it feels like things are we're not there, but moving in that direction. On the other hand, I think, people believe a lot of contradictory things. If you ask people about the word government, I assume it polls extremely poorly. But if you ask people, do you still want to have public schools? Do you want to have the post office? Do you want to have, a lot of things like that are still supported. And people may not think of that as government, but I think that in terms of thinking about organizing, I don't think it would make sense to have a campaign to say, let's try to get the goal of having people react favorably to the word government. But I do think that it's possible to organize campaigns around a lot of public services that people recognize that would end up being an educational kind of fight.
How about you, Samir?
Yeah, no, I think these are great answers. I think both Adolph and Gordon have kind of set the terms pretty well. I think, the answer again is yes and no. What I would add, I suppose, is insofar as there is cynicism or distrust around government, kind of circling back to Adolph's point, I think, in a lot of ways, it comes from the success at undermining the capacities of government to deliver for people. So, you underfund basic public services for long enough that they stop working for people. And that's going to result in a degree of cynicism about the ability that they could ever work, especially for people who, are under a certain age, have never really seen them well funded, have never been around a government service that has been actually functional and not either difficult to deal with or punitive. So I think that's part of the story also, and we'll probably talk about this, but I think there's a longer history to why this is all the way it is, which is wound up with the failures to build a more robust public sector in this country and to achieve universal programs that actually could stand the test of time. I mean, the ones when we talk about what people really do associate with favorably, Medicare, Social Security programs that everyone, at least at some point in their life, in theory, gets access to, stand in sharp contrast to services that are means tested, which I think maybe we'll talk more about what that means and, how this all works. But, people who see others benefiting or maybe accessing a certain kind of public service that they're not able to access because their income's a certain level, a little bit too high or whatever, that breeds resentment and, creates the conditions of a lack of solidarity and contempt within the working class. And so that's part of it as well. So yeah, it's a big question, but I think the answer is yes and no, but increasingly, unfortunately, I think yes.
This podcast is all about the working class. So before we move forward, let's talk about what we mean by working class. Who does that include? Adolph, what's your definition of the working class?
Yeah, sure. I'll give it a start to get the ball rolling because I have a pretty simple sense of who the working class is. I mean, for me, the working class is everybody who has to or is expected to work for a living. Right. That is people who don't live off investments or trust funds or whatever. And the large mass of people whose main experience of life is having to go to a job someplace or to find one if they don't have it. Right. And of course, we can specify that some more and talk about questions like who supervises who or what supervision means and so forth and so on. But my preference has always been to start out from that most broadly shared experience among all of us who live in this, or as many of us as possible who live in this country, and we can kind of slug it out from there as to who belongs to what stratum. And that's my preference, partly because, since the end of World War II, if not before, elite organs of public opinion or knowledge shaping or whatever, from the universities to the newspapers, have tried to make class and political economy and the working class invisible, right? So we find ourselves all kind of lumped together in this amorphous foolishness called the middle class.
On the refining side, I agree with what Adolph said, but I think if we're thinking about this in relation to the first question, if we're thinking about this as, okay, if there's a political organizing project, who is the population that we're trying to move, then I would take out some chunk of the professional and managerial class. And I think those are people whose experience is the government and the system is working okay for them. They might not feel like they rely on government, but the people who are saying now, we're in a crisis of democracy because people in the right-wing base no longer have respect for institutions like the courts and the rule of law and stuff like that. I think, a lot of people's experience is all of those institutions are cooked for people at the top, but people in, I don't know if it's the top 10%, 20%, something like that, those institutions work. And so I think that when we think about who are we organizing, I would not include the managerial and professional people.
Yeah, I think that all sounds right. And I mean, I think one way, I just, again, in the spirit of refinement, and this may account for some of, what Gordon's point here as well, is that I think it's basically, if you're screwed if you lose your job, pretty soon you're a member of the working class, which is most people. There are some people who they don't have enormous family wealth, but they make enough money that they could lose their job, weather it out, probably get a new one pretty easily. Yeah, maybe they don't fit in the mold, but most of us and most people, if you lose your job, you're screwed pretty soon. Maybe you got enough savings to last a little while longer than the next person, but not that much longer. So the dependence on a job is, I think, sort of the defining feature of this. And that's, gets back to Adolph's point, which is really, if you're expected to go to work for a living and you can't really handle an extended bout of unemployment, which is, again, most people alive today, then you're a member of the working class. And I think the point of this discussion is to just sort of unsettle the idea of the middle class. For so long, this idea of the middle class, like, what is the middle class? Who's middle class? Maybe that term made sense 30 years ago, if you had a house in the suburbs with a picket fence. But how many people these days are able to access that?
And I think Gordon really touched on this. First, that there are different worldviews that have to do with how one sees politics and what one sees the stakes of politics, right? So like I mentioned at one point that, back in the Watergate era, polls showed that, working people didn't really care about Watergate. And they didn't care about it not because they were cynical, but because they just knew that's what politicians do. And that didn't really address, their direct concerns about politics. And like our experience in South Carolina a number of years ago kind of underscored that people, so even operating in a context in which there are attempts to sort of press, what used to be called hot button issues, like, same-sex marriage, abortion rights, flying a Confederate flag, I don't think we ever encountered any working person who asked us about our positions on those questions because we were upfront about addressing concerns with jobs, healthcare, housing, and education. And one of the problems here is that we've got a bipartisan politics on which, like, both the major parties have been fundamentally committed to shifting, the plane of political debate away from what working people actually need to some other stuff. And I know that may be a little simplistic as a way to put it, but to some extent, we can say, and this kind of helps us to think about what the question of what to do with the professional and the managerial strata. And as Samir noted, they're a big, wide stratum. And I'm the kind of social scientist who would say that the way that we can tell which way the professional managerial stratum is going to go in its politics is to see which people in it, tend to agree with a working class program. And those who tend to agree with the working class program are on our side, and those who don't are on the other side.
On that note, let's talk about what a working class program would look like.
Well, yeah, I think it's the basic stuff, right? The right to a job and a living wage, and a meaningful wage, right? Economic security, right? Access to healthcare and to other public goods like education, postal service, without constraint by ability to pay. There's just a bundle of attributes that, we think that are necessary for everyone to have access to, to participate fully and decently and to be a member of the society, right? So, that's an opener, I'd say, and I'll pass it on to others for refinement.
Well, how about Samir? You mentioned earlier the concept of means testing, right? And Adolph just said all these programs should be available to everyone, regardless of income. Can you speak to that a little bit more?
Yeah, I think this is a crucial point in a discussion like this. So when I'm thinking about what a working class program should be, I often think back to 1944 when Franklin Roosevelt outlined what he called an economic bill of rights. He's like, we got a political bill of rights back in the day for free speech and freedom of assembly and all these things, which are obviously important. But actually living a free life requires economic security as well as political freedom. And so he listed a bunch of things: the right to a job that pays a decent wage, right to housing, right to healthcare, right to education, right to security in old age, all these things, some of which we got, right, or at least a little bit of them we got, most of which we didn't. And what was kind of implicit in that is that these are rights. They're rights that are for everyone. They're basic things that a free society ought to have. What we ended up having for the most part in terms of government programs, we got some of those, right? Medicare, Social Security, right? There's some security in old age that we have, which we didn't have prior to, the 1930s and 1960s. So that's progress. But most of the social programs that we have are what we would call means tested, which is, this term that is what it sounds like, right? Your eligibility for them is tested based on your means. Basically, if you have an income below a certain level, you're eligible. If you have an income above a certain level, you're not eligible. That level is set pretty low. And so a lot of people who are struggling aren't able to access things because their income is just a little too high. And that breeds all kinds of resentments. You hear this all the time. You talk to people who are just by a bit iced out of public housing or food stamps or any number of things, Medicaid. And it leads people oftentimes, and understandably, because they're struggling and it's not their fault that they're iced out of these things, not to think, well, wow, imagine if we had this for everyone, but to resent their neighbor who is on whatever social program is means tested that they're not able to get access to. So I think, thinking universally, that like everyone ought to have access to certain things. And, this is what Bernie Sanders talked about, right? And what he got knocked on by Clinton and Biden and others is that, well, now we're going to be providing things for rich people. And like the level of cynicism of that charge, right? That the problem with a universal program is that it's going to subsidize a rich kid to go to college or a rich kid to get healthcare or what. I mean, it obscures the fact that really most people aren't rich. And what a universal program does is ensure that most people who are currently struggling get access to things that they need to survive, so they don't have to worry about basic stuff, like whether they're going to be able to pay rent or go to the doctor or whatever else. And so I think that's universalism is a key. And universalism just meaning everyone's in, nobody's out, right? That principle to public programs is, I think, what a working class politics would look like.
Yeah, I agree with what Adolph and Samir have said. I think it's really important. And just a few things that I would add also. So one, obviously, that a good government would make it much easier to organize unions in the workplace. But also, I think trade policy would look different. That's not exactly buy American, but is saying, a lot of manufacturers largely don't want to manufacture here, but everybody wants to sell here. I think a workers' government would say, look at ways to say, can we use the consumer power of the United States as a consumer market to push back against a system where all work goes to where people are the most desperate and most politically repressed. I also think technology policy might be different. We're not going to be Luddites, and technology is not going to slow down, but the directions it goes in, hopefully more drug research would go to actually creating newer drugs as opposed to just creating competitive products for a disease that somebody, a different company already has a drug for. Could we have technology to make it easier for nurses to turn patients in hospitals, or to have cheaper ventilators? Like, you could think of all kinds of things that are not what the market has produced, but that would be useful for millions of people. And that I think it would go more in that direction if we had this kind of government.
I mean, I think, and Adolph, you should jump in here, but I think maybe a theme here is a working class government would challenge the idea that everything ought to be determined on the market, right? And would say, look, there are things that there's a role for the public in determining outcomes. The price of pharmaceutical drugs and the types of pharmaceuticals that we have shouldn't be just determined based on like a handful of pharmaceutical companies, trying to bet on what's going to be most profitable. They should be determined through some kind of assessment of what we need and a planned out process for getting there. And you can think about this in a variety of different industries and sectors beyond pharmaceuticals. But the bottom line is that like the idea that profit should guide every last thing in our society is clearly not in the interest of most working people who are never going to see any of that profit to begin with. And the idea that that profit's going to lead to innovations and investments that benefit working people has just simply not borne out. That's what we've been saying for the last 50 years. And here we are today. So I think generally, the idea that all this stuff ought to be determined on the market is something that a working class government would confront. But Adolph, you can put it more eloquently than I can.
Oh, I don't think so, but I certainly agree. And I was thinking also, I mean, that to go back to the means testing question for a moment, yes, it certainly undermines solidarity, right? And I'm just looking at the way that this history has played out. I mean, every program that's defined for one narrow constituency creates not only that narrow constituency, but creates a lot of opposed constituencies, right? Because you create, the population that's partly defined through getting whatever the service or the good is, but you define also a bigger population by definition of people who don't get it, right? And we've seen this consistently since the end of World War II, like homeowner populism, right? That took shape after World War II, that basically offloaded national housing policy to the real estate industry, creates a class of homeowners, and workers are then encouraged to understand themselves off the job as homeowners who are arrayed against other homeowners and renters and people who are coming to challenge their housing values, who may even be the same people that they would have been or would be in solidarity, with around on workplace issues. And that's happened, from issue to issue to issue to issue. And we've been encouraged to think like this because of the last 50 years of a retreat from the idea that policy should be or should serve the interests of working people. If we think back, just to the Democratic debates in the presidential season during 2020, almost every other candidate, with the possible partial exception of like Elizabeth Warren or like 15 minutes of Kamala Harris, defined himself or herself by standing up to Bernie Sanders, saying over and over and over, it's unrealistic for people to expect anything from government, right? Klobuchar, Buttigieg, right? All the rest of them. So how do you expect then if one candidate, right, in this discussion is presenting himself as an advocate for the real concerns of the vast majority of working people in this country, and if all the rest of the candidates define themselves by attacking him for standing for anything, well, you may not need to look much farther than that to get part of the explanation of why it is working class people have come to lose faith in government even more sharply than in the past.
So we all know that the number of workers who have unions in their workplace has declined significantly over the past 40 years. A lot of the things that Samir just mentioned were won in an environment where unions had a lot more power than they do today. Why have unions declined, and how does that impact our ability to win a working class agenda today?
I think one thing that maybe people don't quite realize is how much the labor movement has declined over the last few decades. So just to put some numbers on it, in the 1950s, one third of all workers were in a union. And now in the private sector, 6% of workers are in a union. In total, if you include public sector workers, it's about give or take 10%. It's a significant shrinkage. And in the private sector, 6%, that's like close to zero, right? We're at the levels that existed in the Gilded Age. But the point is that it used to be pretty big, right? 1/3 is not everyone, but when 1/3 of the workforce is unionized, that has an effect that's felt far beyond those who are in unions. And that effect is economic in terms of wages rising, keeping pace with productivity, ensuring that workers actually saw some of the gains through the period that, we keep referring to World War II, this period from the end of the Second World War to the 1970s or so, which is, one of the only times in history when economic inequality actually shrank. That happens in large part because of the labor movement having the economic power that it had. But it also had a lot of political power, real political power to shift the terms of debate in political life. Never as much as, maybe we would have hoped, never as much as it did in certain other countries where there was a Labor Party and they had real representation in government, but way more than what we could imagine today. And this was the backdrop to winning things like Medicare, in 1965. The labor movement plays a crucial role in securing Medicare. Plays a crucial role in a whole host of other progressive reforms that happened from the 1930s through the 1970s, even reforms that are sort of outside of what we would think of as economic. That's not something that people know, right? And so I think this is a huge, very important contributor to why we are where we are, is the fact that the labor movement has dropped in both economic and political power as much as it has.
Yeah, I'd just like to add a little bit of punctuation to that point right before I give the floor to Gordon. But I've often commented that for most working people, we actually got more from the Richard Nixon administration than we got from any of the 3 Democratic presidencies that succeeded him. And it's not because Nixon liked us, because he certainly didn't. He didn't want most of us here even. But it's that the social movements that advanced the interests of the working people of all sorts. And broadly, I would include the civil rights movement, because we wouldn't have won those victories without the labor movement either. But they were so strong that even Richard Nixon had to take into account their presence and their power, and at least a game against them. And Carter, Clinton, and Obama haven't been constrained in the same way because of the decline of labor. So that's just kind of a telling bit of punctuation. But Gordon, I'll give way to you, brother.
Okay. Yeah, I think everything that was said, I agree with. And I would add to that a couple things. One is that unions also serve as a kind of political education to politicize the people involved in them in a certain way. There's explicit political education. But apart from that, first of all, just the experience that you have rights at work, that there's like a kind of system of rights and kind of, crude democracy within the workplace. is something that people don't think about, but that makes you think of, I think part of the ideological project of the corporate right is to stop people from thinking we have a right to anything. So that experience within the workplace is different. I also think to the extent that people get engaged in union fights, they kind of get implicitly educated towards seeing the employer as the enemy and the employer as the barrier to having a decent life, as opposed to, all the things that employers want to point to, cultural elite, government, whatever it is. So I think that that's educational also. And one of the things I think is interesting, both about unions and about the question of government, is that as life has gotten harder for most people, I think politics has come to a point where people are moving both more to the right and more to the left, and not just in the US, but other places. So, it's interesting that, as Adolph said, everybody's telling Bernie, oh, this is impossible. This will never happen. Nobody will go for that. But when the polling actually shows very strong support for things like free community college, free childcare, Medicare for all, right? All these things poll strongly across both political parties. So, and the same thing with unionization. There's now, the latest poll shows there's now maybe 12, 13 million people who have unions in their workplaces. And the polls show that there's another almost 60 million people who say, I wish I had a union in my workplace, or I would vote for a union in my workplace if I had one. So we're since this podcast has been so depressing, just to put like a little on the other side, I feel like we're standing at a point where things could get really bleak. But part of the reason for the vehemence of the opposition is that, the corporate people see the same polls as we do, and they're afraid of things spilling in the other direction. Like a lot of their opposition to Medicare for all, which you see sometimes, is like, we can't let people get in their heads the idea that you can tax rich people and give yourself something. Because if they do that with healthcare, they're going to want to do that with transportation. They're going to want to do that with school. They're going to want to do that with ever, right? So they also see that we're at a point that could flip either way. Obviously, it's been going more in the bad direction, but I think it's important to think about where people are at if we're talking about a political organizing project.
Yeah, Gordon, that's a really important point, man. We are coming very closely to such a point. And the thing about the other side's perception, as is so often the case, like their perception of CRT, but as is so often the case, they're basically right. And that's been all of our experience on this podcast, and probably the experience of most people who are listening to it, that when people start to think that they have a right to one thing, then yeah, they start to think they might have rights to other things too, right? Healthcare, well, why not education? And that's correct. And the problem is a problem for the liberals or the liberal elites, right, is that they want desperately for the old relationships to hold, right? They want desperately to be able to count on enough of what working class support to hold whatever share of power it is that they hold, with just a promise that, well, I got to go take care of Wall Street first, but don't worry, I'll come back for you eventually. Well, eventually it's come and gone, and people are suffering more and more and more. And I thought that this was the key question in 2020, and I'm still holding my breath now as we go through the Build Back Better bill, bill and the politics around that, is whether those liberal elites are more afraid of the dangerous right or of an assertive working class. And I'm not sure what the answer is. And I don't think any of us is sure what the answer is. But I'll say this too, when I was a young man, just after the wheel had been invented, there was a slogan that came out of the student movement in France in 1968 that was, be reasonable, demand the impossible. And I never thought much about that then. I thought, okay, this is one of those clever things, but it makes a lot more sense to me and is much more practical now. And especially after living through 2020, where, as we both said, what came from the mainstream liberals was, shut up, it's irresponsible to want anything. But I think we are at a crossroads. I've sometimes described it lately as a T intersection, and there are only two ways to go from it, right? Either toward the dangerous right or toward an approach to politics and to government that's more self-consciously centered on trying to meet the needs of working people. And again, but the right understands that that's where we are. And I think one of the frustrations is a lot of the liberals, the liberal establishment, the sort of woke whatever, either can't see it or don't want to see it, and are hoping that there's some other way out of this that doesn't depend on building a movement openly on solidarity among the working class. But I think part of our point here today and forever is that there is no way around it. So we have to do what needs to be done, as a man once said.
And I think following up on this, again, going back, linking this to, Adolph's point that, we got more from Richard Nixon than we gotten from any Democrat since, and Richard Nixon hated us and we got more from him. It's because, again, we had some power to force it from him then. And to Gordon's point that, 60 million people want to be in unions but aren't, getting where we want to go with the Democratic Party, most of the Democratic Party, like we should say, a line from the Labor Party that both Adolph and Catherine were part of was that the boss has two parties, we ought to have one, right? This experience that I think we're going to talk about in a separate episode, but that for the last half century, the corporate class has had two parties working in their interests, and working people have had zero parties working in their interests. And that only changes if one of those parties is forced, or both of them are forced, to act in the interest of the vast majority of people who have to get up every day and go to work for a living. And that process of forcing them requires some kind of organization, which is what the labor movement has historically provided. But the reason that those 60 million people say they want to be in a union, they're not, because it's really hard to form a union in the United States. And that goes back to Gordon's point about what a working class government would look like. We could talk about all these things we want and that we ought to have, but how we win them, is through struggling and building enough power to wrest them from the ruling class, right? The corporate class, which is represented by both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party in different ways. We shouldn't say that they're exactly the same, and more so than ever, they're not the same. But when push comes to shove, it's unclear how different they are. And so reforming labor law to make it easier to unionize is a huge, huge part of this struggle. As long as we got the Senate the way that it is, maybe, winning a labor law reform at the federal level is challenging, right? But the more that we're struggling, the more that people are trying to organize at the workplace and pushing the needle on that, the more likely something's going to be to give. And the reason it's so hard, I should just be clear about this, Amazon doesn't fight an organizing drive at a warehouse tooth and nail because they're afraid of paying a little bit more money. Right? It's not just about the wage. They don't want to pay more money. They don't want to pay their workers $25 an hour and give them health care and a pension, but they could afford that. Jeff Bezos can afford that. They don't want to do it because they don't want to give up the power that they have over workers who have no say at work. And that's to Gordon's point, right? Workers who have a union experience something that workers who don't have a union don't. And it's that you got a voice at work. You've democratized this place that is otherwise run like a totalitarian regime. And that changes how you think about the world. And if 60 million more people thought about the world differently as a result of having some democratic rights at work, the political culture of the country would change considerably. And that's what they're really scared about. And so I think it's important for, working people, for us to just always be stressing that they are scared of us. They're scared of us being organized. And that's why they fight so hard to prevent us from being organized. In a country where 6% of the private sector workers are unionized, what do they have to fear from unions, really? But they still do. They still hate them so much. And there's a reason they hate them.
Just to add on to that, I think one of the places you see that is in the last, 5-10 years, you see more campaigns where the opposition to unionization is not only the employer, but also local politicians. When workers organized at VW in Tennessee, the governor, Bob Corker, when he was senator, the mayor came in and said, we're going to cut state economic development benefits for Volkswagen if they allow a union in. At the Nissan Drive in Alabama, similar kind of thing. And I think they, of course, Republican politicians are worried that if you get a few thousand union members, it's going to be money going to Democrats that turns out against them. But they also think they're talking about it in big parts of the country and certainly big parts of the South. Nobody has any experience with a union. It's so far gone. And the idea that, then thousands of people working at whether it's Amazon or Nissan or something like that are going to have a union, I think they're also scared about that spreading really quickly if it gets a toehold in. So it's not just about Amazon. If the politicians come in because they want to make sure there is no beachhead for unionization in their state. And that's, both bad and good, obviously. I can say, when people always ask, okay, so what do we do and what's the way forward? Obviously, if somebody really had the answer, we wouldn't be where we're at. So I don't either. But the closest I can come to is doing politics around issues, which means running ballot initiatives in cities and states where that's legally possible. And the reason I think is that I know union members who will say, I hate government, I hate Wall Street, I hate insurance companies, I hate lawyers, and I hate immigrants, and I hate people on welfare. a lot of hate to go around, right? And we're kind of saying, oh, you should take all that anger and aim it at the Kochs and Wall Street. And they're saying you should aim it at gay people and immigrants or whoever. And that's the level at which the fight takes place. And I think to fight that fight while trying to get people to vote for Democratic candidates is a very uphill proposition in almost all cases. But to say, okay, we want to raise the minimum wage. We want to create a right to paid sick leave. We want to say there can't be more than 20 kids in a classroom. All kinds of things like that, both because they poll across political parties and because organizing around an issue is a better vehicle for educating people than organizing around a political party or particular candidates. And I think from the labor movement side, one of the things that we have to change is in the past, when the labor movement has won ballot initiatives even, we've done it by, it's just like desperation to win. So you get the pollsters and focus group people who do everything, and they come in and say, don't say the Chamber of Commerce is bad. Say, if they don't let you deduct union dues, you won't be able to give to United Way. Like, you just have the clever line that gets you over the line of winning, which I understand, right, when you've got to win. But on the other hand, it does nothing to educate people. And if we would run a series of ballot initiatives that we also treated as vehicles to say, look, it's the Chamber of Commerce that doesn't want you to have a minimum wage, and the same business lobbies don't want you to have paid sick leave or have, universal pre-K or something like that. I'm not going to say this is a formula for anything, but this is the best I can think of as a direction to go and to take people who are essentially filled with, anxiety and resentment and the rage that comes from that could go in a lot of different directions and try and educate a big chunk of people in a productive direction.
Hey, that sounds great, man. Among other things, that's what's all that we've been about for the last 30 years. So that's perfect.
Yeah, I think your analysis is spot on. It reminded me that in the 2020 election, lots of local minimum wage initiatives passed around the country, but the same voters also elected politicians who don't support those initiatives. So there's already that disconnect there, right?
Right, because people don't necessarily vote based on the issues that we think they should vote based on.
Right.
Unfortunately. The one other thing I could say that I haven't seen, and I think is even harder to do, is to try to change candidate campaigns into issue campaigns. And I could say at the very local level, let's say school board elections, instead of saying, vote for Catherine Isaac because she's really nice and she loves children, if we said, we're going to support everybody who supports these three things. Right. And so you try to convert the candidate race into an issue race, that also would be kind of like ballot initiatives, a way to do more political education.
And yeah, the one thing I would add is just filling in tactically, because most people aren't accustomed to thinking like this anymore, but that this kind of takes a page from the right, basically, tactically, that you don't just put out a call for a ballot initiative, right, around the topic. But what you have to have done, what I assume, is some non-strategic organizing around, the issue among the constituency within the locality anyway, right? At a minimum, to try to identify people who would be adept at and committed to working in the initiative campaign, right, to generate support. So I guess what I'm saying is I think you need to have something of a base of militants or of activists, right, who are committed to build the kind of support that you would need to feel fairly confident about being able to run a successful ballot initiative campaign. Does that sound right to you, Gordon?
Yeah, I agree. I also think one of the implications of what you're saying, and that I think is true, is that overwhelmingly people get educated in the midst of a struggle or a fight. Right. And I would say, as somebody who teaches classes and writes things, overwhelmingly not by attending classes and reading things.
Right, absolutely.
Right? Which means, which also means that the less fights there are, the less education there is, and we need to look for those opportunities.
Yep.
Yeah.
And that just kind of what underscores, I think, from a different angle, Gordon's point that we really have to build a popular movement on, that's all of our points. We've all been saying the same thing forever. Build a popularly based, class-conscious, political movement that will turn whatever the politicians or the current complement of politicians is into ones that are more favorable for us, either by getting rid of them or by changing the matrix of incentives for the ones who are already there.
This has been a fascinating discussion. Let's wrap up this first episode of Class Matters with your final thoughts. Gordon?
But, I was thinking of part of what you were saying earlier, Adolph, about the Democratic Party being in hock to Wall Street, that, both parties obviously have contradictions between their donors and their base. But as you said, the Republicans figured out this deal where the corporate people who don't care about social issues are fine funding them, and the evangelicals who don't really care about corporate taxes are fine with that. But on the Democratic side, they haven't, right? Between the Wall Street tech, Hollywood money, and at least the labor movement part of the party, there's a contradiction that has not been resolved. And I think that there are a number of people within the Democratic Party who would like to get rid of the labor movement and be able to construct a majority based on identity groups. And this is not the only, there are people who use identity politics for better purposes, but I know there are Democrats who are thinking, well, if we get this chunk of moderate Republicans and we get women because we're for reproductive health rights, and we get Black vote because we're like mildly better on police violence or something, and we get Latino vote because we're mildly better on immigration, that we can get over the finish line, right? And we get some people who are just alienated by the Trumpists, and then they can solve the contradiction, not in the way the Republicans have, but actually by jettisoning the problem of the labor movement and other people who are really pursuing working class politics. And I think there are people in the Democratic Party who are watching the demographics and trying to figure out if they can make that move, which I don't know what that means, except to reinforce what you were saying, Adolph, of the importance of organizing in the other direction and not just being part of that kind of party.
So I think you're exactly right. That the polarities are shaping up that way. And I think it's time for all of us to understand that, just because somebody invokes or evokes like an image of the civil rights movement, doesn't mean that the agenda that they're advocating is one that'll do anything for the vast majority of Black and brown working people either, right? We're closing the racial wealth gap, for instance, which exists between the richest 10% of Black people and the richest 10% of white people, while the bottom 50% of Black and white people have the same amount of wealth, which is zero, clearly does nothing for the vast majority of us, right? But that's an understanding of a racial justice agenda that Bezos et al. Can get behind. It works very nicely for them. So that's a very important point.
What's interesting about this, too, is that, obviously, and I think recent elections have borne this out, most working class and poor Black and brown people know that projecting the image of the civil rights movement on the screen isn't doing anything for them either, right? The way that, we're seeing this in election after election now. And that's what's, I think, perhaps most alarming about this. It's that it is lending itself to either increasing disaffection from politics entirely or a ceding of working class votes to the Republican Party, working class votes of color to the Republican Party, which is like the notion that can't happen. There's been this assumption among elite liberals that can't happen, that'll never happen. Taking for granted constituencies that they think are just theirs by virtue of the way they look. That's not necessarily going to hold forever. And unless something changes in the Democratic Party, we could be staring at something very, very dangerous in a couple of years. And the bottom line, what's so frustrating about it is it's clear that most working class, people of color in cities and most working class white people outside of cities or around cities care about the same things, and they feel like no one's speaking to them. And that's why we're seeing what's happening happen.
Thank you, Adolph Reed Jr., Gordon Lafer, and Samir Sonti for this important discussion. You've been listening to Class Matters podcast. You can subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and support us on Patreon. Before we go, I'd like to give a special thanks to our editor, Jimmy Wirt, and for production work, a big thanks to Kate Summers. And thank you for listening to Class Matters.